go. All right. With that, I am pleased to introduce Jeff Forster, the Executive Director of Minnesota Lakes and Rivers, Lakes and Rivers Advocates. And Jeff, we'd love to hear about your program and some of the work you're doing to protect our lakes and rivers in Minnesota.
Okay, and this was adapted from a presentation I did for the Subcommittee on Water Policy. And you can advance the slide, but really what happened is there's a upwelling of interest in this. Shoreline protection legislation to make that happen. How does this fit together? They wanted to know what we thought the legislature might be able to do to help protect shoreline, and I can get into some of those ideas later. We started in 1993, so we've been around a while. We have 280 Lake Association COLA organizations. When we started, we worked with the Minnesota Lakes Association. Paula West was running that, and we partnered. But then they kind of went away. Paula retired, and in about 2008, 2009, is when they kind of sunsetted, and then lake associations began to come to us, and we took on more of those lake association issues. Next slide. So it's really about this idea that we manage water, we manage land, and the way we work is we use civic partnerships. So this is the idea that different groups of people have a jurisdiction, they have capacities, they have different roles. So by partnering, you can accomplish more and more of a systemic change. So for instance, we have a civic partnership up in the Ely area working to prevent the introduction of aquatic invasive species into the boundary waters. Quantico Provincial Park is part of that. Voyageurs National Park, U.S. Forest Service, DNR, the Sea Grant, Cook, Lake, Northern St. Louis County Soil and Water Conservation Districts, MLR, 1854 Treaty Authority. So let's say, there's, right now we're working on signage. Well, we need DNR and U.S. Forest Service to kind of work through the requirements of getting signage up, or maybe CD3 cleaning stations. They can do that. We can raise money. You sort of pair the capacities and move forward. We do professional advocacy. We have a lobbyist that works at the Capitol. We have programs for lake associations. We support science. One of the first things we worked on with AIS was I started meeting with Peter Sorensen at the U to create the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center, and we lobbied. The legislature created that. The first funding came from LCCMR, from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust, and we've worked to increase funding for them through a couple of different mechanisms, and we're working again this year to support that science. Media, do a lot of articles, Facebook, all that, and then education. Next slide. So cabin owners, lake home and cabin owners, I often make the point that these places are heirlooms, not assets. So we have land on Lake Vermilion on an island in northern Minnesota. It's been in the family since 1905. So I tell my daughters, right, like, when we die, you can sell the house in town, but if you sell the island, then we will haunt you, right? Like, it's a separate thing. And there's some information here, there's often this idea that it's just really uber wealthy people that own lakeshore in Minnesota, and that's not the case. Next slide. And this is what lake associations are. And now, the 500 plus lake associations spend about 6.25 million annually on projects, but then they also contribute 1.2 million volunteer hours. So there's a ton of energy, but it tends to be pretty parochial. Like a lake association is just looking at that one lake. And so a lot of our work is to try and get people to understand that water moves, that they're part of a watershed, that it's a bigger picture, kind of expand that view. Lake associations don't really feel like they have good partnerships with the DNR, which is an issue that we're working on. And you look at the top 3 concerns, it's AIS, water quality, and runoff control. So that's shoreline in a lot of cases. Next slide. And this is the idea is, an agency or a county or soil and water conservation district cannot achieve the results we need without a significant shift in the attitudes and the practices of the citizens. So we're really looking at a systemic shift. I mean, Mike, you and I talked about this when we met. You can get a lot of projects on the ground and get them done, and they're going to help. But the marketplace and the consumption of land is unrelenting. It's 365 days, 24 hours a day. And we need to shift that. And I think that's where, having really good civic engagement can have an impact. And this is our place, by the way, up north. Next slide. So we have a problem, and you guys are probably all familiar with this. Algae blooms are getting more intense. They're lasting longer. They're larger, and they're it's kind of seems to be coming on. If you go back one slide. So we're in a little shallow scallop bay, and that land you see out there is a small island, and it's 7 miles across the water to that far shore. For the first time in my life, that entire expanse of water was pea green soup last summer. And that Scallop Bay, like where that boat is, all the way into shore, was blue-green algae. And there's no agriculture on Lake Vermilion. I think it's so things are changing, and they're changing pretty quickly. Next slide, please, or 2, I guess. When we started working with Lake Steward, I reached out to the DNR, and Paul Radomski at the DNR formed kind of a shoreline working group, a statewide shoreline working group. Some nonprofits like us, there's some Soil and Water Conservation District folks, Minnesota Extension, looking at the problem. How do we, what is the problem? How do we define the problem? And this is some of the data that the DNR brought, and you can see the high quality natural shorelines are pretty much just in that northeastern corner of Minnesota. The rest of it, 40 to 50% has been developed or lost. And I think these trends are accelerating. Next slide, please. And there's the algae. That's the blue-green algae. So next slide. So Lake Steward. So a lake association contacts us, and they need a volunteer, and we work with the volunteer and kind of get them educated about the program. We have a 20-minute video that covers kind of the basics. There's a phone-based app that they use that takes them through questions for each category, shoreline, upland, near shore zone, septic, chemicals, all those things. And then there's a link that lake associations can put out on Facebook or social media, or soil and water conservation districts can do it, that just says, are you a lake steward? And someone clicks on the link and it's a quick 10-question quiz. Everybody thinks they're a lake steward, and then they find out that maybe they're not. And when they take the quiz, we get their email, and then the lake association then has that email, and they can follow up with the property owner as a lake association volunteer and saying, hey, you took the lake steward quiz. Are you interested in this? Do you want to talk more? And they say yes. And then you go out and you see what their interest is, and help them through that process. One of the areas where, so if they meet the criteria for the lake steward, then they get the sign, and the sign has the lake association logo on it. So it signifies to people out on the lake what the mission of the lake association is. And it basically, what it's doing, right, is it's qualifying leads for professional resource managers. So instead of that first contact being somebody from an agency or a local government saying, can we help you restore your shore? They're taking it, and it's their neighbors that are talking to them. And what we've noticed is when a lake steward sign goes up, pretty quickly you start to get signs nearby. People start to take action. The gap, the limiting factor at this point is getting the projects done. There aren't enough resources resources in terms of people, number of people in the private sector or in government to help do shoreline restorations. So that's a place where I'm thinking we can work with the legislature to create a funding stream to help develop that capacity. Next, and I'll say this for the Lake Association. I'm a volunteer on Lake Vermilion. We picked up last year 5 members for the Lake Association. They took the quiz. We went out, met with them. They're like, oh, this is great. I didn't know what the Lake Association did. Yeah, I'll join. And so they joined. So it's good for lake associations that way as well. Next slide. And this is this idea of the social norm, this diffusion of innovations. Can we get to 15% of lakeshore owners wanting to have natural shore? Because you buy you work hard, you live in the cities, or maybe Bloomington, or somewhere nearby, and you achieve the dream. You've got some money, you buy the lot, and what you see when you look at that is a suburban style home. It's a failure of imagination. You don't understand where you are and what the impacts are to the water until after you've already made choices that degrade it. So how do we shift that, right? And that, I think, is what they see around them and the neighbors and so forth. And communications from lake associations, from peers, that kind of education supported by the more detailed scientific education that comes from professional resource managers. So we worked with a number of groups last year and put out the Shoreline Guide to Lake Steward. And so this can be a leave behind or a giveaway at meetings. It's 34 pages, so it has some detail, but it's not super complicated. We're working to get lake steward training and ideas into realtor groups and to landscaping companies and to University of Minnesota landscape design courses and architecture programs, because the requirements of building on a shoreline are different than they are in South Minneapolis. And I think if we can get, kind of a critical mass, then we can start to get a shift. Next slide, please. So this was, we started it. I learned about it from Dorothy Whitmere on Gull Lake. They had piloted the program there, and then she called and wanted to take it statewide. So we worked with her to take it statewide. Last summer was our second year. First summer was a little bit hinky because of COVID. 259 Lake Steward quizzes taken, 238 site visits. These numbers exclude Gull Lake, and they're about the same numbers. So after 4 years, they've really penetrated that lake, and it's, you know, a lot. They've had a lot of engagement. We had 19 lake associations participate, 6.3 miles of shoreline impacted. And those, when I say impacted, I mean they either arrived, like our shoreline, you saw it's natural, so we were a lake steward. But some people are in the process of restoring their shore, and that can take a year or two. So that's what I mean impacted. Potential of 28,209 pounds of phosphorus sequestered, and more than 1 mile of shoreline restored. So more than a mile. Actually, I think it's probably, I'll say a mile, but I think it's probably closer to 2.5 miles of protected shoreline that's finished, that's done. Next slide. Another thing is agricultural. So we're working with Pine River Watershed Alliance on Up the Creek Meats to promote regenerative ag food producers to local lake associations. So the idea is, if you want to protect your lake, then buy your meat from this person, right? Create local markets for local products that protect water quality. And this has been harder to expand. It's a more complicated kind of chain, and COVID made it very difficult at the start for people to, you know, go to a meeting. You know, farmers were planning on showing up at like a lake association meeting and, you know, providing food and, you know, exchanging information and getting orders, and that kind of fell apart because lake associations were meeting virtually. Last year we had a little bit more success, but we're going to keep working on this because I think it's really, really important. Next slide, please. And then the Starry Stonewort program. So Starry Stonewort was first discovered in Coronis in 2015 for the first time in Minnesota. The next year it was in like 5 lakes in that Stearns Wright County area. A couple years later, it was discovered up kind of Beltrami, Cass County area. Now there's clusters of it. In 15 years, Michigan went from its first discovery of Starry Stonewort to over 1,000 lakes infested. And so we're trying to interrupt that by providing boat cleaning equipment, CD3 boat cleaning stations at accesses where Starry Stonewort is present, so people have the tools they need to clean, drain, and dry on their way out of the lake. So it's a containment strategy. Next slide. We've got over 20 units out. You can see the other information. This diver assisted suction harvest is really an interesting thing. The Leech Lake Band is kind of trying to dial this in and figure out how to work. And it really, again, gets back to this civic partnership. So in many cases, it's these pictures are from a local resort. The resort owner got Starry Stonewort at their landing. So he's a partner. Lake Association is supporting his efforts to get the word out about it, and talk about it at public events like street fairs and so forth. Leech Lake Band of Ojibwa owns the equipment and puts it on his site for free. They're also doing the dash. The DNR is involved in the permitting process, so it kind of takes a lot of different entities to get something like this done. Next slide, please. This kind of gets to where lake associations are, their attitudes and experience dealing with DNR permitting, and how they work through that process. There's a gap there. The next slide, please. Legislative agenda, wake surfing, boat activities. We're supporting the St. Anthony Falls Lab Study, Phase 2. Phase 3 is in the LCCMR bill and the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. So we're lobbying to have that included. We also, last 2 days, I've been working on getting authors for a bill that would require boaters under the age of, I think it's 34, to take a boater education and certification program. And we would teach the research from St. Anthony Falls. So how far does a boat need to be away from shore so that its wake doesn't cause erosion? How deep do certain boats need to be so that they're not reanimating lake sediments? And then teach these things. Also AIS, and then all the rules of the road that people normally would do as a sort of a first step to addressing these problems. Property tax, I talked about a little bit. It really makes lake shore management difficult because it's just so like the shoreline taxes are really high, kind of statewide. Aquatic plant management grants and the permitting process, which I referenced earlier. Boat ramp improvements to include boat cleaning equipment, better drainage, better ramps so that we're not reanimating sediments when people power load and all that. I think the state should have a 5-year coordinated plan. I think the DNR budget on AIS is about $6 million a year or $8 million a year. The counties are getting about $10 million a year, and the lake associations are spending $5 to $6 million a year. And there's no coordination of those three entities. And each of them can play a different role. So when I talk about civic engagement, how do we bring those people together and create a comprehensive, coordinated statewide plan that's got some accountability in it? And right now, we don't have that. It's just everybody's kind of doing their own thing. I also don't think we should export water from Minnesota. I think it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe, the Chicago Board of Trade started to trade in water. Reservoirs are way down, aquifers are way down across the country, and everybody's eyeing Minnesota's lakes. So we're working on that, some sort of legislation that would prevent that. Next slide. And then membership. I think, really, because lake associations are focused on individual lakes, they've never really accepted the role that they have a political role. And by political, I don't mean Democrat or Republican. What I mean is advocating for a public good, right? That definition of politics that we learned in 8th grade when we had to take the Constitution test. We have to be citizens. And that means we have to engage politically. That means that we have to work with people who have different ideas than us. That means that we need to engage these ideas at the Minnesota legislature and advocate for them. To me, that seems to be one of the biggest gaps in protecting water in the state. There's a lot of different agencies. There's an alphabet soup of governmental units that are managing water, but we lack a statewide advocacy force. And one of the things I'm a pheasant hunter and a duck hunter. There's 90,000 duck licenses sold in the state of Minnesota, and Ducks Unlimited has 60,000 members. There's about 70,000 pheasant licenses sold in the state of Minnesota, and Pheasants Forever has about 42,000 members. There's 300,000 lake home and cabin properties in Minnesota, and we've got 6,000 members. Is it because hunters understand that if they don't engage politically by forming an advocacy group, that there will be less pheasants and there will be fewer ducks? And why don't lake, shore, and cabin owners have the same sort of idea? And I think it's because, you know, I mean, part of it's like you go to the lake to get away from people and you want to sit on the end of your dock and drink your coffee or not. It's a different kind of mindset, but it's something that I think we need to change if we're going to be able to make the kind of change we need to meet this moment. Next slide. Thank you. Any questions?
I want to
Kind
add a
of sped
couple
along
things.
there.
No, I want to share a couple of things both for Jeff to hear and Jerry to hear and the staff to hear. You know, you talked about your book, the Lake Stewardship book, the guide, and Jerry, we did, Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District did buy, I think, a dozen or so copies so that we could provide one to the leadership in each of our lake associations, and then have discussions about if we need additional copies or what other kind of tools can we put in the toolkits that we're, you know, that we're creating to help kind of spread information and some knowledge. In some of the conversations we've been having both locally and at the, you know, kind of larger areas, looking at those public access points that Jeff was talking about and having the AIS cleaning stations, but also looking at doing some demonstration projects of what a healthy shoreline looks like. So people coming in through those public access points, we're starting to normalize some of that work. You know, Jeff, just one thing, you know, kind of to keep in mind as we're working with the Comfort Lake and Forest Lake Watershed District Lake Associations, a lot of our lake residents, these are their year-round homes. And so I think that no one type of lake homeowner has more skin in the game or not, but it may change some perspectives. I think we might think this is an interesting opportunity to look at how the Lake Steward program and engagement with something like this could work with some of our urban year-round lake residents. And then finally, you talked about membership in your organization. We're hearing a lot of conversations from our lake associations. How do they increase their membership? And so I think there might be some opportunities to work together and kind of support these different organizations as they engage people and engage them to the point of becoming members as well. So those were the few things I wanted to kind of throw in there. Jerry, do you have any questions? I think this was great for Comfort Lake staff to hear this presentation as well, so that everyone kind of, you know, knows what's being talked about. But Jerry, I'm going to ask you, do you have any questions?
Well, first of all, thanks for, I was intrigued by the book, so I'm glad you got copies of it. I'd like to take a look at that in more detail. Jeff, a couple of questions for you. Is you mentioned you have maybe up to 2 to 2.5 miles of shoreline restored. How was that funded?
It depended. In some cases, there were matching grants with the lake associate, you know, with the property owner from a soil and water conservation district or a watershed district. Gull Lake made funds available to support that. You know, some people just paid for it themselves. It depended on where the budgets were. You know, in some one watershed, one plan, there's money for lake restoration or shoreline restoration. So it's kind of local in how it works. I think a statewide effort would be better. But I don't, you know, at this point it isn't solid. But you know, the thing about the shoreline I'm sure, are you familiar with Burnett County, Wisconsin and their shoreline restoration? Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah, so Burnett County started, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, because I'm going from memory here, but I think it's like they give you $250 and then $50 off your tax bill every year that you have your shoreline restored. And they're like 96% compliant now. Their requirements are not as high as Lake Stewart. Like Lake Stewart is higher than the minimum standards for the state of Minnesota, you know. It's kind of above and beyond. But the money isn't the biggest issue. The support that, you know, having somebody who knows what they're doing show up and be able to do the design and the engineering if that's required, and which plants go in and all of these things. That's, you know, the expert support is a big deal.
I
Jeff,
know that. Oh, go ahead, Mike. I apologize.
No, well, I've offered this to the board multiple times over the years as a suggested option. And I pointed to that, at least some framework there, and we've talked internally about, or I really want this to be a part of our package that we do for Comfort Lake, Forest Lake. I was part of a pilot program. There was a similar one down in like a very micro area of Pepin County, like part of a township where they did a property tax credit. And I happened to be talking to the county conservationists down there when we were trying to figure out a pilot program for our watershed program. And so when the farmers heard about this, because they didn't like all this other spending all this money on the wrong thing. So, which was typically build a barn, spend a lot of money on something that's really not the problem. It was the sort of the scale issue. So we did that where we were paying $6 an acre for non-highly erodible, relatively flat farmland, and $8 for more highly erodible, which required a little bit more work, so to speak, or the rotations. We had unbelievable participation. And farmers told me that, yeah, it was a small number compared to what they were getting from the federal government for their other programs.
Right.
But it was just the fact that it was taking it off their property taxes.
Yeah.
So there was a real factor with that, because it was really, by and large, for all of us, we were very surprised. We had 28% of the farmland signed up in year one. Every other program in the state was happy to get 18 to 20% after a 10-year window. So there's absolutely something, even though, right, and I know people that have properties up there. It's not a lot, but it's partly, it absolutely is getting that. But also, I think to your earlier slide about social norms, creating an expectation that this is what a lake home resident or owner should have. So it's a combination, I think, has seemingly worked for them, and I hope that we can convince the board to implement something that includes an option like that. And it may be some tiered level of, like, maybe if it's a higher level like you're talking about, or there are some that are, when we do the Score Your Shore, they're like way up there.
Yeah.
Maybe that's another level. So, but yeah, I think why not? Let's look at things that are just successful and try to incorporate them.
Well, in your first slide about how lakes are an economic driver for the community, that's absolutely true. It's undeniably true. Every major city, most towns in Minnesota are on a lake or a river. Maybe there's a few in Southwest Minnesota that aren't. In 6 counties in Minnesota, Lake Shore makes up more than half of the tax base. And we have been working with some smart people to develop the capacity to isolate a lake and actually pull the tax base of a lake in comparison to the regular property versus the shoreline property. So you can make this case, this is what's being protected, right? And it's a numbers thing. And then the other piece, Mike, that I think is so interesting is you meet with people and they've got, these beautiful lawns right down to the water. There isn't a weed in them, and these lovely landscaping with walls and patios and all this stuff. And a lot of what's driving that is they don't want to be the eyesore in the neighborhood. They don't want their neighbors to think they're the one with the crappy yard. And so it's totally a social construct, and I think people resent property tax more than any other tax because you got to write that check,
Oh, yeah, it's very, very visible.
Yeah, it's and
But-
so we have been promoting a Sustainable Shoreline Incentive Act, which would provide a property tax refund for natural shoreline. And I think it's complicated, but they had the Sustainable Forestry Incentive Act, and they were hoping to get 100,000 acres of Minnesota forest enrolled. And, in 10 years, like you were saying, and they hit 250 in like 5 years. So it definitely is a way to shift the conversation.
On the social norm part, I know it's the wrong state, but so I grew up in northern Wisconsin, and my friends their family has a cabin on Lake Owen outside of Cable, Drummond area. And so there's some national forest land in there, but the biggest landowner is Johnson, the Johnson Wax family. And they own like 13,000 acres up there. And they have more miles of road than we do in our township that I grew up in. So, but they also own a ton of the lake property. But for some reason, they like the fact that they have all this mature wood timber hiding the view. So they're not out there with a multi-million-dollar buildings, and anything that comes for sale, basically they're buying. So, and, adding to their campus, so to speak, whatever. But it's kind of an interesting, you have all the money, you can do whatever you want, but you somehow have placed this level of value on it, not to do exactly what you're talking about from a social norm standpoint. They
Right.
see their role in terms of protection, or maybe they like the privacy. I'm not sure, but it's just an interesting observation. I was just up for the first time in years up there on that lake this summer. So
When I was in college and like kind of late high school and then into college summer job, I was a roofer. And you would bring the sample case to people and say, well, what tile do you want? And 95% of the time it was like slate, gray, or black. Meanwhile, it's like Illinois, and it's 100 degrees out, high humidity, and the air conditioners are just running full bore, and those roofs are just hot. Why? Well, because when we think of a house, we think of a dark roof, because in New England, the roofs were slate. And that aesthetic has just carried across the country until you have people in Southern California putting black shingles on their homes. It's a failure of imagination. We have to see things differently. And that's kind of where I think Lake Stewart or the property tax, you start to see your neighbor do it and you're like, oh, okay, now I get it. You have expanded your view by not, the education is a piece, but then it's also seeing it through the eyes of a peer who see it differently, if that makes sense.
I want to make sure that we keep moving. I'm watching the time, and I
Okay.
want to, Jerry, you asked about funding, and kind of Jeff shared some of the different mechanisms for funding that are out there. I do want to add that The Launch to Legumes program, which is being run through Bowser and the Blue Thumb program, has about $800,000 that it's going to be passing through this year to residents doing pollinator plantings and shoreline work. They're only about $350 per project, but those are, that's $800,000 in combination. That's a lot of money going through there to go to a lot of different properties. So that's something that any resident on your lakes could apply for a portion of that money to do shoreline work as well. Jerry, do you have any other questions for Jeff right now?
Just one comment, Jeff, I want to make.
Yeah.
You talk about the membership of MLR, and I think you have 280 lake associations as part of that 6,000, I think. I think one of the things you have to maybe recognize is that, in our lake association, we have over 500 members. Forest Lake is a member of MLR, and we do pass on to our membership, I guess, some of the pertinent information that comes out of MLR. So in some cases, you maybe need to consider the fact that you are getting exposure to individuals who may not be a direct member with MLR, but are associated with MLR because they're part of our lake association. The lake association is part of MLR. That's all.
Right. So Judy retired this year. She ran the office and did a lot of the administrative tasks. So I'm doing that. We have a part-time bookkeeper, and we have a contract lobbyist, and we haven't upped their hours in a decade because we don't have the budget. So the media and all those programs, that's just me. And to kind of doing the best I can do. If we could build it out a little bit so there was one or two other people in the organization, then we would have a significantly larger impact.
I would suggest that you encourage lake associations to encourage their members to join MLR.
Yeah, that would be great.
I mean, that's an easy thing that most lake associations can do. We all have communication with our membership, and have some sort of a communication that we as lake associations can send to our members to say, hey, this is a great organization. I know you're paying the dues to lake association, but consider paying something to MLR also. So we as Forest Lake would be happy to do that.
Okay, I'll reach out to you.
All right, sounds good.
Next week or something. Thanks, Jerry.
Sure.
I appreciate that.
Sure. Other than that, Beth, I don't really have any other questions at this point in time. I have another commitment at 7, to be honest with you. So I do have to get off here in a short.
All right. Jerry, would you allow us to move forward and guys, I apologize for doing this to you. We can maybe record this and make it available. Jerry, can we have that 5 minutes to?
Yeah, absolutely.
Blaine?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
I'm gonna ask Blaine to speak to the CAT program. I'm gonna ask Emily to talk about the grant program. And Mike, if it's okay with you, I'm gonna let Aiden and Garrett just go ahead and hop off, and we'll skip those slides for tonight.
Yeah, I mean, unless you do want to just have them even off. I mean, if Jeff wants to listen to them or not, it's up to everybody else. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Jerry, we've got 5 minutes with you, so I'm going to have Blaine start right now.
Thanks, Beth. Jerry, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some of the engagement opportunities that we do have with the district, specifically focusing on some that you've probably heard of, the zebra mussel plates. We are looking for volunteers just to hang them off our docks so we can track the populations of zebra mussels. We do have the CAMP program, which you're probably familiar with. That's our citizen-assisted monitoring or lake monitoring program. I believe we have Forest Lake covered, but that is an opportunity for citizens if they're interested and if we need volunteers in the future. The one program that I would like to really chat with you a little bit about is our citizen-assisted tributary monitoring program, or our CAT program. This is an extension of our diagnostic monitoring program. It's kind of our in-house low-cost monitoring for diagnostic monitoring. We're really, with this program, trying to target kind of micro drainages throughout the Forest Lake Basin. These real small, flashy systems that are really hard to monitor. What we're really trying to do is engage citizens, get a group of folks together that might be willing to go out, during a storm event, grab a couple water bottle samples of a small drainage in their backyard or their neighborhood, and then turn them over to district to analyze with some of our pocket colorimeter technology, just to get an idea of what type of loads we might possibly be having coming into the lake. If we do identify kind of hot spots, we can go back with our traditional diagnostic monitoring and validate those things. And this is how we select projects to implement to remove those loads from the watershed and help improve water quality in the lake itself. And I would be very much interested in coming and giving a presentation to the Lake Association, if that would be okay. I've been preparing a presentation, take 10-15 minutes at one of your monthly meetings, and just try to maybe get a few more volunteers for that program, if that would be all right.
Yeah, Blaine, absolutely. You can sure come to one of our board meetings. The other thing about all of this too, again, if you want to put the information together, I'm happy to send this out to our membership. We have about 60% open rate on any emails I send out. So that's 300 to 400 people that are reading our emails or opening them at least. So, we can certainly, I wouldn't suggest we do it now. Middle of winter time, people aren't thinking lake yet, but come March, I think we could probably get you some additional volunteers for some of these programs.
That'd be fantastic. And I'll reach out to you here in the next few months and see if I can schedule a time to meet with your
Sure,
group.
that'd be fine.
Thank you.
What an incredible open rate you have, Jerry. That's awesome.
Yeah, they look at the title, but if it's appropriate, we have, I think our highest has been a 65% open rate.
That's great. That's great. I'm going to move through the next couple because I think that if we can take the next minute that we've got with you, give it to you
Beth,
and Emily.
Can I
Yes.
make a suggestion? Emily and I are trying to get something scheduled with others, staff within the district here. I would suggest, and I've got to put some thoughts together on this before we have that call. So I'd like to try to set up a separate Zoom call to talk through this.
That's perfect. That's fine.
Okay.
That sounds good to me. I'm going to stop the share real quick, guys. Jerry, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, guys.
It's unfortunate that some of the others didn't join us, but we've got it recorded. We'll get you more information. We sure appreciate your work.
And Jeff, thank you. And I've always enjoyed reading your information sent out to us. And let's see if we can get some more of our members as part of MLR. All right. Take care, guys. See you
Thanks,
later.
Jerry.
All right,
We'll
bye-bye.
get some more information to you.
Okay, bye-bye.
I was muted. Thanks, Jerry.
Jeff, Aiden had some follow-up questions for you. Aiden, did you want to send them to him or do you want to try to ask those questions now?
I think probably both. While we've got a little bit of time with you here, I guess the biggest question I had is, looking at your slide with the, that really high conversion of, number of quizzes taken, number of site visits, and then, presumably projects